History Secrets.
To understand what may happen in the coming years, some analysts begin by observing a recurring pattern in history: the cycle of rise, decline, and collapse of societies. These three stages appear repeatedly throughout human history. Empires emerge, grow rapidly, stabilize for a period, and eventually enter decline. But it is important to understand that decline does not necessarily mean everything immediately gets worse. Decline often simply means that progress slows down, things stop improving, and begin to stagnate. Collapse, however, is different. Collapse occurs when a society rapidly loses its stability. Institutions stop functioning, conflicts intensify, and social order begins to disintegrate. Each of these phases has specific characteristics. During the phase of rise, societies tend to be open. Openness means something simple: opportunity. Poor people can become wealthy. Talent is valued. Innovation is encouraged. Criticism is seen as useful. In rising societies, public debate is encouraged. New ideas are discussed. Mistakes are corrected quickly. This collective energy drives economic and cultural growth. Interestingly, this phenomenon does not necessarily depend on the political system. Different regimes can go through phases of openness when they are in a phase of rise. In the mid-20th century, for example, both the United States and China experienced periods of great social mobilization. Both sought to build strong and innovative societies. But as time passes, changes begin to occur. When societies enter the phase of decline, bureaucratic structures tend to grow. Bureaucracy emerges when institutions try to preserve stability. Officials begin to create increasingly detailed rules. Administrative processes become more complex. Organizations begin to focus more on maintaining the existing system than on innovating. At this stage, the priority is no longer progress. The priority becomes stability, keeping everything functioning exactly as it is. But when decline deepens, something else happens. Society may enter an authoritarian phase. At this stage, power no longer depends on consent and begins to depend on force. To illustrate this difference, imagine three ways of making a simple decision: choosing where to have lunch. In the phase of rise, everyone discusses, debates options, and decides together through consensus or voting. In the phase of decline, the process changes. The decision still appears voluntary, but someone manipulates information to influence the outcomes, perhaps by promising advantages that do not exist. In the phase of collapse, there is no longer negotiation. Someone simply imposes the decision, and those who disobey face punishment. This model can be summarized in three words: consent, deception, coercion. Another important aspect involves social relationships. During the phase of rise, people feel that they are part of a collective project. There is empathy. There is cooperation. There is trust. In the phase of decline, the focus changes. Now the priority is to maintain the status quo, to avoid changes that could threaten the system. In collapse, the dominant instinct becomes survival. Individuals and groups begin to act in self-defense, even if that means direct conflict with others. Another interesting detail involves the pace of these transformations. Rise tends to be fast. Decline tends to be slow, but collapse can occur suddenly. Many people believe that a society in decline will continue to exist indefinitely. But history shows something different. Collapses usually occur when multiple crises arise at the same time. Wow. Wars, economic crises, environmental disasters, pandemics. Individually, these crises can be managed, but when several occur simultaneously, the system can become overwhelmed. This phenomenon is often called a perfect storm. Societies usually prepare for specific problems. A plan to deal with war, another to deal with epidemics, another to deal with economic crises. But they are rarely prepared to face all of these problems at the same time. When that happens, institutions can fail rapidly. There is another important factor: the capacity for internal criticism. During the phase of rise, people who criticize the system are valued. They help correct errors. But in more advanced stages of decline, criticism may be seen as a threat. Those who point out problems begin to be treated as enemies. This creates a paradox. The more a system needs criticism to adapt, the less it tolerates that criticism. As a result, societies may lose the ability to prepare for future threats. Problems accumulate, and when crises arise, it is already too late to react. Based on this historical model, some analysts try to make predictions about the future, especially for the Western world. One of the most discussed predictions involves the weakening of democratic freedoms. As systems enter phases of decline, governments may adopt more authoritarian measures. Another prediction involves economic difficulties. When citizens lose confidence in the system, motivation to work and invest may decrease it. This reduces economic growth. Another possible phenomenon is the increase in migratory flows. Governments may resort to immigration to compensate for labor shortages. But rapid demographic changes can also generate social tensions, especially when local populations feel that their cultural identity is threatened. These tensions can evolve into internal conflicts, protests, political violence, deep ideological divisions. Finally, some analysts believe that governments may resort to external conflicts to deal with internal crises. Wars can serve as a way to mobilize the population, or redirect social tensions. This does not necessarily mean that these predictions will come true. They represent only hypotheses based on historical patterns. Analytical models are tools. They help interpret trends, but the future is never completely predictable. If these predictions are confirmed in the next 5 or 10 years, the model will gain credibility. Otherwise, it will need to be revised. This is the true objective of any historical theory: not to impose certainties, but to offer frameworks that help us understand how power and societies evolve over time. If we accept this model of rise, decline, and collapse, then the central question arises: what does this mean for the current world, and especially for the next 5 to 10 years? According to this interpretation, many Western societies may be entering an advanced phase of decline. This does not necessarily mean that everything is collapsing immediately, but it indicates that certain structural signs are beginning to appear. The first sign involves political freedom. In young and rising societies, freedom of expression is usually broad. Public debate is encouraged. Criticism helps improve the system. But as institutions age and become more rigid, the space for criticism may shrink. Governments begin to see opponents as threats. Political control measures begin to expand. This can lead to the gradual weakening of democracy. Emergency laws, greater use of security forces, restrictions on certain types of speech. According to this analysis, this phenomenon can already be observed in various parts of the world, not only in traditional authoritarian regimes, but also in consolidated democracies. The second prediction involves the economy. When social trust declines, collective motivation also declines. People begin to feel that the system does not work for them. If citizens believe that effort will not be rewarded fairly, productivity may fall, investments decrease, innovation slows down. This can generate periods of economic stagnation, or even deeper crises. The third possible consequence involves immigration. Governments may try to compensate for demographic decline or labor shortages by bringing in foreign workers. From an economic point of view, this may seem like a practical solution, but rapid demographic changes can also generate cultural and political tensions. Local populations may feel that their identity is being replaced, and social conflicts may arise from this perception. This leads us to the fourth prediction: internal conflicts. When inequality, cultural tensions, and political polarization combine, societies may face episodes of civil violence. These conflicts do not always take the form of open wars. They may appear as violent protests, conflicts between ideological groups, or isolated episodes of political violence. But even fragmented conflicts can erode social stability, especially when institutions lose legitimacy. The fifth prediction involves external conflicts. Historically, governments facing internal crises sometimes resort to external wars. Wars can mobilize patriotism, they can redirect internal frustrations, and they can temporarily strengthen governments. During wars, populations often accept restrictions that they would normally reject. Economic controls, emergency laws, expansion of executive power. For this reason, some analysts believe that international conflicts may become more frequent during periods of internal instability. It is important to remember that these predictions do not describe a fixed sequence. These phenomena may occur simultaneously, or in different orders. Political freedom may decline at the same time that economic crises arise. Immigration may increase while social tensions intensify. External conflicts may appear amid internal crises. This type of combination creates highly unstable environments in which political decisions become increasingly difficult. Even so, this model is not intended to be an inevitable prophecy. It is merely an analytical tool, a way of interpreting historical patterns. If the coming decades follow this pattern, the model will have demonstrated some usefulness. If events take a different path, it will need to be revised. That is the nature of any theory about history. It tries to identify patterns, but it must always remain open to revision. Because the future rarely follows exactly the script we expect. Unexpected technological changes can alter historical trajectories. New leadership can transform political systems. Crises can generate profound reforms. Human history is full of surprises. Empires once considered invincible have disappeared. Societies once considered fragile have become powerful. Therefore, understanding the mechanisms of rise and decline does not mean accepting fatalism. It simply means trying to better understand the forces that shape the world. If we can understand these forces, perhaps we can act more consciously. Perhaps we can avoid certain mistakes of the past. And perhaps we can build more balanced systems in the future. Because in the end, theories about power and history are not just intellectual exercises. They are attempts to answer an essential question: how can human society survive and prosper over time? And this remains one of the most important questions of our time. Each historical discovery reveals new clues, but also raises new questions. Because when it comes to the past, there is always something we still do not understand. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
There is a provocative question that we rarely ask about an institution present in the lives of almost everyone: school. Today, it seems like something natural. Children attend classes daily. They follow defined curricula. They learn standardized content. But this structure did not exist for most of human history. For thousands of years, children learned mainly within the family or the community, with their parents, with artisans, with older members of society. Then an interesting question arises. Why did the system of compulsory public education appear relatively late in history? And why did it first emerge in very specific contexts? Some historians point to three societies that introduced systematic forms of compulsory public education: Sparta, Mesoamerican civilizations such as the Aztecs, and later, modern Prussia. Each of these societies had something in common: a strong military structure and an intense focus on collective organization. The state created public school. Sparta, for example, became famous for its rigorous educational system. Children were taken from their families at a young age. They underwent intense physical training. They learned discipline, obedience, and endurance. The central objective was to prepare citizens capable of defending the Spartan state. Among the Aztecs, educational systems also existed to transmit fundamental cultural and religious values. And in Prussia, in the 18th century, the state developed a highly structured model of public education. This Prussian system would deeply influence school models, later adopted in various countries. These examples lead some thinkers to reflect on a broader function of educational institutions. Beyond transmitting knowledge, schools also help shape collective identities. They teach national history, a common language, shared symbols, cultural narratives. The state created public school. These elements play an important role in forming what we call the nation-state. Before the emergence of modern nations, most people primarily identified with local communities: the city where they were born, the region where they lived, the family or clan to which they belong. The idea of belonging to a large national community is relatively recent in history. Public education played an important role in building this national identity. Through school, different populations came to share the same standard language and the same historical narrative, a common set of civic values. This process occurred in various countries during the 19th and 20th centuries. In Europe, in the Americas, in Asia. As modern states consolidated, national education systems expanded. It is important to note that this does not mean education exists only to serve the state. Schools also perform many other fundamental functions: literacy, scientific development, social mobility, cultural formation. Modern education has brought immense benefits to human developments. But understanding its historical origins helps reveal that social institutions often have multiple functions. They transmit knowledge, but they also shape identities, values, and worldviews. Another point raised by some thinkers is the relationship between education and abstract ideas that structure modern society. Among these ideas are concepts such as money, individual, nation-state, The state created public school. These concepts are not physical objects. They are social constructions. They exist because billions of people agree to treat them as real. Money has value because we believe in it. National identity exists because people share this collective belief. The very concept of the modern individual was shaped over centuries of cultural transformation. These ideas structure the way we organize societies. Economy, politics, rights, responsibilities. But ultimately, they all depend on collective imagination, on the human capacity to believe in shared concepts. Some philosophers describe this phenomenon as a modern form of social alchemy. Ancient alchemy sought to turn lead into gold. Modern societies turn ideas into powerful institutions. An abstract concept can become a political structure. A currency can become a global economic system. These processes reveal something fascinating about human nature. Our ability to imagine complex systems, and then organize entire societies around these ideas. This creative capacity has shaped virtually all structures of the modern world. Religions, states, markets, educational institutions, all were born from shared ideas that gained strength over time. Understanding this does not mean denying the importance of these institutions. It simply means recognizing that they are human creations. And like all human creations, they can evolve, they can transform, they can be rethought. Perhaps the most interesting point is this: if collective imagination was capable of building the modern world, it can also imagine new paths for the future. Because, in the end, societies are made of ideas, and ideas continue to change. If we look at the history of human societies, we notice a recurring pattern. Major cultural transformations arise when new ideas begin to completely reorganize the way people understand the world. One of these transformations occurred with the emergence of monotheism. Before monotheism, most ancient religions were polytheistic. Multiple gods represented forces of nature, cities, tribes, or specific phenomena. These religions were usually deeply connected to local communities. One people worshipped their own gods. Another city worshipped others. Monotheism introduced something radically different: the idea of a single universal God, an absolute principle, a single source of moral authority. This change was not only religious, it also had profound consequences on how societies began to organize themselves. When there is a single universal God, the idea of a universal truth also emerges. A universal morality, a universal law. This way of thinking paved the way for new social concepts. Among them, the concept of the individual. In many ancient societies, a person's identity was completely tied to the group. Family, clan, tribe. The person existed primarily as part of a collective. But monotheistic traditions began to emphasize something different: the direct relationship between the individual and God. Each person came to be seen as responsible for their own actions before a single divine authority. This concept would deeply influence the development of philosophy, ethics, and political institutions in the centuries that followed. The idea of individual conscience, the notion of personal moral responsibility, and later, concepts such as individual rights. Another concept that evolved within this process was the modern state itself. Throughout history, political communities began to organize into increasingly larger structures: cities, kingdoms, empires, and finally, nation-states. The nation-state is a relatively recent idea. It assumes that millions of people, often spread across vast territories, belong to the same political community, even if they never meet in person. For this to work, something fundamental is required: a shared narrative. This narrative includes a common language, national history, collective symbols, cultural values passed from generation to generation. Public education played a central role in this process. It helped create a collective memory, a shared identity among people living in different regions of the same country. Something similar also happens in the economic system. Money is one of the clearest examples of a social construction based on collective trust. A piece of paper has no intrinsic value. Its value exists because people believe in it, because they trust that others will also accept that same symbol of value. Throughout history, different forms of money have emerged and disappeared. Metal coins, banknotes, financial credit, and now, digital currencies. Each of these forms depends on systems of shared trust. This reveals something fascinating about how human societies function. A large part of social reality is constructed from collective ideas, institutions, laws, economic systems. All of this arises from the human ability to imagine abstract structures, and then act as if those structures were concrete. This process is not necessarily negative. On the contrary, it has allowed complex societies to emerge, cities to be built, global economies to function, scientific and educational systems to develop. But understanding this dynamic also reminds us of something important. Institutions are not immutable. They evolve. They change. They transform over time. Ideas that seem natural today were once considered impossible, and ideas that seem permanent today may one day be replaced by new forms of social organization. Human history is, in large part, the history of these transformations. Changes in the way we think, changes in the way we believe, changes in the way we imagine the world. Perhaps the most interesting question is not only how we got here, but where these ideas may lead us in the future. If collective imagination was capable of creating institutions such as modern money, the nation-state, and global educational systems, then it can also imagine new ways of organizing society, new models of cooperation, new forms of human prosperity. In the end, perhaps humanity's greatest resource is not technology, nor material wealth, but the ability to imagine new possibilities. Because every great transformation in history began exactly like this, with an idea. Throughout history, many events have been recorded, but others have disappeared over time. Lost manuscripts, forgotten accounts, evidence that never reached us. But this raises an inevitable question. How many truths of history do we really know? Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
How does a civilization control millions of people without them realizing it? This question runs through history since the earliest human societies. China, the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and Egypt didn't just survive. They dominated. Each found a different solution to the same fundamental problem: social control. In China, the answer was bureaucracy, a rigorous system based on exams that directed all the energy of the population. For centuries, entire families lived with a single goal: to ensure their children passed the imperial exams. This mechanism created order, predictability, and stability. Interestingly, this model still exists today, just under a different name. In the Indus Valley, the strategy was completely different. There, control did not come from competition, but from equality. A religion based on harmony, peace, and social balance shaped the society. This system would later become the foundation of what we now know as Buddhism. In Mesopotamia, the scenario was different. With no natural barriers, war became inevitable. External instability generated internal cohesion. Collective survival depended on constant conflict. And then, Egypt. A civilization that took control to a radically different level. There, power was not just political. It was divine. The pharaoh did not rule merely as a leader. He was considered a living god. But there was a silent problem in this structure. The pharaoh was human, and a human at the top of an absolute empire lives under constant threat. Conspiracies, betrayals, internal disputes. The question then changes: what truly defines a great leader? On the surface, we learn familiar answers. Responsibility, wisdom, empathy, knowledge. But history seems to point in another direction. An uncomfortable direction. Great leaders are not just prepared, they are shaped to survive in extreme environments. And for that, three characteristics repeatedly emerge. The first is unpredictability. A leader who cannot be predicted cannot be easily manipulated. The second is high stress tolerance. Pressure, criticism, hatred, all become irrelevant. And the third is the absence of empathy. The ability to make decisions without being paralyzed by the suffering of others. These three characteristics, when combined, form something deeper. A specific psychological state. An internal rupture. We call this dissociation. Dissociation is not just a clinical concept. It is a powerful mental mechanism. It is the ability to detach from one's own experience. To observe oneself as if you were another person. Like a spectator inside your own body. This state creates an emotional distance that allows actions impossible for most people. And it is precisely this distance that transforms behavior. Unpredictability arises because there is no fixed self. Stress tolerance appears because pain is not felt in the same way. And the lack of empathy manifests because others are no longer perceived as equals. But why does this work? The answer may lie in something even more complex. The dynamics of social games. In systems with millions of individuals, winning does not depend only on skill. It depends on positioning. Alliances, hidden interests, invisible connections. True power lies in occupying multiple spaces at the same time. But this creates a problem. Loyalty. If you belong to multiple groups, how do you avoid being controlled by one of them? The solution is to fragment your own identity, to create different versions of yourself for each context. One person, in each environment. A mind that constantly adapts. This type of mind cannot be easily understood, and therefore, cannot be easily dominated. Now, return to Egypt. If the pharaoh is born into power, how do you transform him into this type of mind? How do you create multiple identities within a single person? The answer may lie in something that at first glance seems merely symbolic. Mythology. Ra, Osiris, and Horus are not just characters. They represent distinct psychological states. Ra embodies the absolute hero, the force that faces chaos daily. Osiris represents the victim, the one who suffers, is betrayed, and destroyed. And Horus symbolizes revenge, the active response against injustice. Three archetypes, three identities. But what if this wasn't just a story? What if it was a script, a system to be enacted, experienced, and internalized? Because in Egypt, the pharaoh did not just believe in these gods. He became them through rituals, intense experiences, and altered states of consciousness. The goal was not to teach, it was to reprogram, to create memories that were not just remembered, but felt as real. Here, a crucial concept emerges. Reality is not perceived directly. It is interpreted by the mind. If you control someone's experience, you control their memories. And if you control their memories, you control who that person is. This idea, discussed by philosophers like Kant, reveals a fundamental limit. We cannot access reality itself, only what we perceive of it. This opens an unsettling possibility. If perception can be manipulated, identity can too. And it is exactly at this point that one of the most controversial mechanisms emerges: human programming. Intense experiences, combined with altered states, can create deep impressions. so deep that they bypass consciousness and begin to operate in the subconscious, transforming behavior, decisions, and reactions without the person realizing it. This logic is not just theoretical. It explains why extreme training works, why repetition shapes skills, and why certain responses seem automatic. But in the case of Egypt, this may have gone much further, far beyond training, far beyond education. Perhaps it touched something deeper, something that completely redefines what we understand as identity. What if the human mind could be shaped like a system, programmable? This idea may seem extreme, but when we observe certain historical patterns, it begins to make sense. In ancient Egypt, power was not just inherited, it needed to be sustained, and sustaining power required something beyond strength or intelligence. It required absolute internal control, the kind of control that does not waver in the face of fear, pain, or doubt. But how do you create this in a human being? A possible answer lies in the combination of two extreme elements: intense experience and altered states of consciousness. Rituals. According to this interpretation, the pharaoh did not merely observe mythology, he experienced it. Under effects that amplified perception, every event was felt as real. Every pain, every fear, every action. The line between imagination and reality disappeared, and in this state, something profound happened. Identity began to fragment. Imagine being led to believe you are Ra, the god who fights chaos every night. You face a threat, attack, destroy. You feel the power, the responsibility, the need to win. Now, imagine being Osiris, betrayed, imprisoned, destroyed, an experience of extreme vulnerability. And then, Horus, the response, the revenge, the reclaiming of control. Each role lived not as a story, but as a real memory. The result is not learning, it is transformation. The mind begins to operate with multiple centers of identity, each activated by context, emotion, or stimulus. And here comes a crucial detail: the trigger. Certain sensory stimuli can activate specific mental states. Among them, one of the most powerful is smell. Scents have a direct connection to memory and emotion. A specific aroma can awaken deep sensations, instantly. If different identities are associated with different stimuli, then it becomes possible to activate them on demand. A leader, seemingly stable, can completely change behavior without realizing it. But there is another even more delicate element in this system: dependence. During intense experiences, especially under trauma, the mind seeks an anchor, someone who represents safety. In the Egyptian context, this figure was Isis, not just as a goddess, but as an active presence within the ritual. A voice, a figure, an emotional support. Over time, this presence becomes essential. The mind begins to associate safety, guidance, and trust with this figure. And this creates something powerful: influence. If this voice can access the pharaoh in vulnerable states, then it can guide his decisions. Without resistance, without questioning. This type of structure does not depend on external force. It operates from the inside out. Now, expand this logic. What if this was not limited to Egypt? What if, at some level, we all operate in a similar way? In practice, we already do. We are different people in different contexts. At home, at work, among friends. Each environment activates specific behaviors. Each situation awakens a distinct version of ourselves. This is not extreme dissociation, but it is a lighter form of the same mechanism. The environment shapes the active identity. And this reveals something important. The human mind is highly adaptable, and therefore, influenceable. But how far can this go? Consider a simple example. An elite athlete. Years of training have shaped his reflexes, his perception, his response. Now imagine he loses all conscious memory. He forgets who he is. He forgets his history. But when he steps onto the field, his body still responds. Because the training is not only in conscious memory, It is in the subconscious, in the automatic system. This is the key point. If behavior can be conditioned, then identity can also be influenced, and in extreme contexts, even directed. This line of thought leads to an unsettling conclusion. With the right stimuli, repetition, and intensity, it is possible to shape automatic responses, to create patterns that activate without conscious decision. This raises controversial hypotheses about control, about conditioning, about the limits of human autonomy. But it is important to keep one point clear. Much of what is being described here is interpretative, a possible reading, not a definitive statement. Even so, there is one element that runs through this entire discussion: the near-death experience. Reports from people who were at the edge of death and returned. These experiences have something in common: a sensation of leaving the body, a state of intense peace, and often a complete review of one's life, as if every action were relived, but now feeling the impact caused on others. This type of experience profoundly alters perception. Values change, priorities change, identity itself can be reconfigured. Now connect this to what we saw earlier. Extreme states can reprogram the mind, and this raises a hypothesis. Were these states intentionally used in the past as tools of transformation? Or were they merely accidental discoveries, interpreted afterward? The answer is not clear, but the question remains. If the mind can be shaped by experience, then whoever controls the experience controls the outcome. And this brings us back to the central point: power, not just as external authority, but as internal mastery. Mastery over fear, pain, identity, and perception. Perhaps this is what separates ordinary leaders from those who move through history, not necessarily more intelligent, but structured differently, capable of operating where others would collapse, capable of acting where others would hesitate, and, above all, capable of disconnecting. From this point on, the question ceases to be historical and becomes personal, because if these mechanisms exist at some level, then they do not belong only to the past. They are part of the structure of the human mind. And this completely changes how we see behavior. What we call decision may not be entirely conscious. What we call identity may not be entirely fixed. The mind is not a single, stable entity. It is a dynamic system, composed of multiple states, and these states can be activated. If you observe closely, you will notice this in everyday life. There are moments when you react with calm, others with impulsiveness. Sometimes you are rational, other times emotional, and in certain moments, you act in ways you do not even recognize afterward, as if you had been another person. This is not abnormal. It is the natural functioning of the mind in different contexts. But when this process is intensified, it can become something much deeper. Now, return to the idea of conditioning. If a stimulus is repeated many times, associated with a specific emotion, it creates an automatic response. This is the basis of almost all learning. But it can also be the basis of something more sophisticated: behavioral programming. A sound, a word, a smell can activate specific internal states, and the more intense the association process, the stronger the response. This explains why certain environments completely change people's behavior, why crowds act differently than individuals, why symbols have so much power, and why narratives can mobilize entire societies. Now, imagine this principle being applied intentionally, not just to teach, but to shape, to create internal patterns that operate automatically. From this point on, a delicate line emerges between influence and control. Because if a person responds automatically to certain stimuli, to what extent are they choosing? This question does not have a simple answer, but it reveals something essential. Human autonomy may be more limited than we imagine. This leads us to another central aspect: Trauma. Intense experiences, especially those involving fear, pain, or shock, have a much deeper impact on the mind. They are not just remembered. They are recorded at deeper levels. And often, they fragment perception, creating gaps, internal separations, or even distinct response patterns. This process is directly linked to dissociation. The mind distances itself from the experience to endure it, but in doing so, it creates a division. One part feels, another observes, and this division can be reused. If this structure is repeated and reinforced, it stops being a reaction and becomes a pattern, a permanent mechanism. And from that point on, identity ceases to be a continuous line. It becomes a set of states that can be activated, deactivated, combined. This does not necessarily mean loss of control, but it means that control can be influenced. Now, connect this to something even broader: culture, religions, educational systems, traditions, all operate through repetition, symbols, and shared experiences. They create collective identity. They shape behavior. They define what is acceptable, desirable, or condemnable. And they do this so deeply that we rarely notice, because for those inside, it feels natural. Perhaps this is the most important point. The greatest form of influence is not the one that imposes itself. It is the one that integrates. That becomes invisible. That is perceived as part of who we are. And when that happens, there is no resistance, because there is no perception of control. But this does not necessarily lead to a negative conclusion. In fact, it opens a possibility. If the mind can be shaped, it can also be understood. And once understood, it can be directed consciously. The difference lies in awareness of the process, between being guided and guiding. Perhaps the ancients discovered fragments of this functioning. Perhaps they explored, tested, experimented. Perhaps part of it was lost, and part evolved. But one thing remains. The human mind continues to be one of the most complex systems ever known. And at the same time, one of the most vulnerable. Vulnerable to experience, to repetition, to narrative, and to what we choose to believe. In the end, the question is not just about pharaohs, leaders, or ancient civilizations. It is about us, about how we think, how we feel, and how we become who we are. 'Cause if there is a secret in all of this, perhaps it is not hidden. Perhaps it is happening all the time. The past does not disappear. It remains recorded in ancient monuments, in forgotten texts, and in stories that have crossed centuries. Each discovery reveals a new enigma, and each enigma brings us closer to the truth. You are watching History Secrets. Subscribe and continue investigating the hidden secrets of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.